Good afternoon, JP Garu.
Good afternoon, Chakravarti Garu.
A country that has seen a protectionist regime destroy our economy now again says, make in India. Make in India goes against the ethos of free trade. If you can't make everything in India, right? I mean, today they are talking about the chip industry. Many companies globally are looking for an alternate location to chip industry, to China. But the components, the material that comes from all over the world, Russia supplies raw material, Japan makes the fabrication machines to make the chips, Taiwan specializes in something, Korea specializes in something. Yet we believe in Make in India, and this government has imposed new restrictions on imports, right? So they say Make in India, and they've imposed new custom duties on toys, electronics, phone components, furniture, everything. So it almost feels like we are going back under an NDA government.
If you
say UPA, I can understand.
I take broadly the view that you are taking, and Arvind Panagaria makes the same point that import restriction or imposing high tariff barriers is not a smart thing, because without imports you cannot export,
right? And
your quality will not improve, you will not become more competitive. But at the same time, selectively there is also a case for protection for a period. Because if you expose all our production forces in the country to international competition, because of the past sins we have committed and made our producers uncompetitive, that also will be destructive. So some measure of protection, for instance, oil seeds, if the farmers get protection from through excise duty or import duty, I welcome it. Because otherwise India will be forever dependent on this very vital food. India is the biggest importer of oil and pulses, and we have to promote indigenous production. But without stopping imports, we have to have some protection for some time. It can't be permanent, and it can't be so high that it kills all competition whatsoever. Similarly, in selective sectors, I fully understand. But if you think that Swadeshi is an acceptable economic alternative to global competition in today's age, obviously it is not. It's detrimental to the future. I think part of it is more style than substance, because actually if you see the imports are growing in our country.
Exports are growing too.
Exports are growing too, but imports are growing much faster than exports. Exports have reached last year maybe the highest, I don't know whether that will repeat or not, 400 billion. Imports probably are more than 600 billion, maybe 650 billion or something. So we are almost $1 trillion international trade now. One of the few countries now in the world with $1 trillion trade, because we simply are a large economy. But imports are growing. It's not that imports are restricted. But perhaps there is a case for a group of experts to decide whether some of the protective tariffs are protective or they're actually destructive. I completely agree with you. But in the broader sense, I think still there is an awareness that we have to do business with the rest of the world. I don't think that the government's intention is to stop all imports or to make, for instance, semiconductor industry entirely domestic. It's not possible.
Unless I was just giving you as an example, right? But what I'm saying, when you say Make in India, and I believe there are 3,600 tariff lines on which now there are restrictions. Now they're even going as far as putting restrictions on aluminum and copper imports, the raw ore. I fear what will happen once you open that Pandora's box. Now the government is open to lobbying from interest groups to get their protection.
It will be 1980s India. 1980s,
exactly. So once you open, it's a downhill from there.
Pranab Mukherjee was the finance minister, and there was a feeling that everything was tweaked.
Right.
And that should never repeat itself. It will be
I very distinctly remember a few years ago, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, government overnight has imposed ban on cotton exports, the gin cotton. What it was around 5,000 or 5,000 plus a quintal, overnight it has dropped to 3,000. Farmers got wiped out.
It was a terrible decision. I completely agree with you.
So
I remember
these erratic decisions we see all the time. If you let the government
run the course. 1984, cotton was booming production-wise, because what we call extra long staple cotton, Dharwar cotton hybrid became popular, and farmers embraced it, and they are producing good cotton. The price that year went up to 1,600 rupees a quintal, which was a great price then, because typically they were getting 800 or so. I was one of those very exultant, very happy. Mrs. Gandhi announced against very heavy global price was much higher. against higher global prices, she announced import of several millions of bales of cotton. Not even one bale was imported. She simply announced it. Suddenly the price fell to 800 rupees next day. Millions of farmers, they were devastated. That is how they manipulated the whole farm sector and the economy. If you go back to that, whatever be the pretext, it's extremely dangerous. For instance, in the import of oil, or palm oil, cooking oil,
Right.
preventing refined oil from coming into the country, I can understand, because we also want to protect our industry. But what they're doing is, not merely refined oil, crude oil they allowed free import. They removed all the tariffs. They'll hurt the farmers. Refined oil, they're now stopping it. So you're only protecting the industry. But there's also a farm sector in India. Even today, 46% of people depend entirely on agriculture. 65% of people still live entirely in villages. And India in the long term requires food security. So somewhere the right hand doesn't seem to know what the left hand is doing.
Right. I mean, economy is very complex to engineer.
So if one element of Indian economy benefits, if another element loses, it's not going to help the country. We must take a balanced view.
Right.
And certainly in some areas, I don't have expertise in a whole lot of international trade areas, but the few areas I understand, there are some causes of concern.
Good. Overall, current NDA regime versus the UPA regime of the past, how do you rank them, or how do you view them? Is one, you do you feel one is better than the other?
It's easier possible to rank because the circumstances change dramatically. As the Chinese proverb says, the river is never the same. It's a flowing water. The river today is not the same as yesterday. 2000, Vajpayee's momentum, thanks to the reform impulses of Vajpayee, that helped the UPA government immensely. 2004 to 9 was a boom time.
Right.
Until the global meltdown because of the banking crisis and American mortgage crisis, housing mortgage crisis that spilled out to the whole world, that was a boom time. That government benefited immensely from that. Essentially, there's always a lag time between a government's initiatives and the economic growth. And I think Vajpayee government did a great service to its successor government by creating the platform. And therefore, the revenues shot up, growth rate went up, employment went up, poverty was coming down. There was a general feeling of good.
Yes.
And therefore, they could afford to go for all kinds of entitlement programs and taking care of the anti-poverty part of it. Some of them ill-advised, some of them well-advised, but it was possible. Post-2009, two things happened. One is the global economic crisis. And the other thing that was advantageous during that period was oil prices were moderate. But post-2009, unfortunately, oil prices suddenly shot up. At the same time, there was a global meltdown, therefore growth rates generally plummeted. Therefore, 2009 to 14, for varying reasons and varying periods, economically we were not that happy. And of course, corruption certainly messed up the government's credibility, etc. Post 2014, for some time at least, the advantage of the oil prices fell down again. But the global growth momentum was not that great yet. And the government's own self-induced injuries, for instance, the demonetization, ill-advised, implemented in the worst possible way. It's amazing that without printing new currency notes to replace the old ones, you would actually, at one fell swoop, say 85% of the currency is no longer legally valid tender. In a country with 90% unorganized sector, with about 50% people dependent entirely on agriculture, it's incredible. It's incredible that the government did not lose support and lose power. Its support actually got strengthened because people believed in the good intentions. They were willing to bear the consequences of bad decisions just because they were good intentions. That's how credibility became a big issue. Earlier, credibility was lost completely. This time, there was credibility. But it was a terrible decision. That certainly had an impact on the economic management of the country, apart from external factors. And of course, 2019 onwards, the COVID created a tremendous problem across the world. And post-COVID, we still have the supply chain constraints. So I don't think we can compare fairly. But I would make two broad points. Some efforts are made to pursue market economy-oriented policies. Bankruptcy code, labor laws, and some infrastructure improvements honestly attempted. Some aggressive steps to try and bring in some big sectors of the economy, big investment into the country, from mobile phones to chips. As a general policy, I welcome, though there are some difficulties sectorally, but I'm not an expert to go into details. I think that's broadly welcome. But the second part is, as you said, the difficulties created because of the notion that ultimately Swadeshi is the right thing, and some amount of xenophobia in our thinking and in our policy formulation perhaps is going to hurt us. The third thing that I see is that real improvements that are required, apart from infrastructure where the government is making earnest attempts, I think we have to concede that. Both Vajpayee government, then now current NDA government. NDA governments have been good with infrastructure. Congress and UPA governments have not paid that much attention. They continued the past policies, but very moderately, without any great ambition. But certainly they are making some efforts about improvement of infrastructure. But the real importance of rule of law, equitable and fair treatment, that the law will treat everybody equally, the government will not tilt the scales, that confidence is not generated. And there is still far too much of centralization. The states are coming to their own, but the third tier of government and the city management, which are critical for the future of India, because cities are the hotbeds of investment. They are the job creators. And unless you are Bengaluru, you are Visakhapatnam, you are Hyderabad, you are Chennai, you are Delhi and you are Mumbai, unless the great cities of India can be managed much better and powers are decentralized, it's going to be a problem in the long term. And finally, there is not enough understanding of what's happening to rural India and urban India. Large-scale migration of unskilled poor to distant cities is a disaster. You have seen in the height of COVID what happened when suddenly employment here suffered in the unorganized sector and millions of people had to walk in the hot sun. I think it's seared in our memories permanently.
Right.
Apart from the moral, if it doesn't persuade us morally that it is wrong, economically, if we don't see a way of managing urbanization, not through diktat, not through planning, but creating some inducement, some nudging by building better infrastructure in small towns so that in situ urbanization takes place and only the highly skilled people will migrate to big cities, but not the low skilled people. We are going to have a tremendous crisis in this country in urban India and therefore economic management in the future. I don't see any sense that the government is getting it. The bureaucratic part, a political part. Right. And I don't see that sense across the political parties. The bankruptcy of India is
they're all equally
parties.
bad.
So it's very...
So as a country, we haven't grounded ourselves ideologically in terms of whether we should
And economic growth is not yet a part of our DNA. That is the most central thing, that we must pursue growth at any cost. Right. The current government at least is saying that. In some respects is walking the talk, but not enough. And
in the second term, there is more talk about
it. But across the parties, somehow the feeling is we have arrived, we have now to redistribute. Redistribute what? Poverty? Without incomes? If more than 1 crore youngsters are coming to the job market every year, organized sector jobs are no more than a few lakhs in the country. And the silly notion that you give government jobs is a disaster for the country. You expressed it very beautifully about the cost versus benefit. In any case, nowhere in the world does government provide the primary employment. Government always provides a small employment. It's the economic growth that has to create employment. And unfortunately, our political system in that sense has become extremely dysfunctional.
SocialPost.news ni subscribe cheyandi.
Please subscribe to SocialPost.news.
Please subscribe to SocialPost.news.
Please download SocialPost app.
Please download SocialPost app.